Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am writing today to the FAA, asking questions about the regulatory regime that is applied to vintage planes like the one that tragically crashed last Thursday. The crash was, in fact, tragic, and we are continuing to have in our thoughts the families and loved ones of the victims who perished, as well as the aviation community and the veterans who revere and respect these planes. And let me make clear at the very outset, these World War II vintage planes and others like them are a respected, even revered part of American history. Part of our respect for those planes should be to make sure that they are safe whenever they are flown. We need to make them available so that they continue to be a part of our living history. But make sure that anybody who flies in them and anybody on the ground when they are flown are kept absolutely safe with standards and criteria that assure that safety. The FAA has responsibility for aviation safety. It has sole responsibility in the federal government for setting the standards, limits, and conditions that apply to any plane that flies, and including private aircraft under a specific section, it's Section 91, and commercial aircraft, a separate Section 135. What we have learned is that these vintage airplanes have been given exemptions from both of those sections. In 2018, a letter to Collins Foundation from the FAA granted a specific special set of conditions, along with an exemption from the general requirements for inspection, maintenance, training of pilots, all of the standards that apply normally to aircraft that are flown either privately or commercially. And we are highlighting today that exemption letter. It's a public document, and we are making it available to you so that you can see, and the public also can read about the conditions that have been set for these airplanes. But my point today is that this crash and other tragic crashes previously, 21 of them since 1982, directly and immediately raise questions about the adequacy of those conditions and regulations. The question for the FAA is now whether these conditions and criteria assure sufficient safety for anybody who flies in these planes and for anybody on the ground who may be victims of a crash. Because there should be no crashes. The same kind of rigorous criteria and standards should apply to these planes as do other planes that fly in the air. To tolerate risk is unacceptable because these aircraft should be made safe. Not grounded, but made safe. And I want to be very clear, I am in no way advocating that these planes be grounded, only that they be made safe. Nor am I prejudging what the results of the NTSB investigation will be. In fact, I was on the phone to the lead board member of the National Transportation Safety Board just about 15 minutes ago, telling her about this letter, and I can say that she fully supports this effort. The FAA should begin this review even before the NTSB investigation is done, but the results of that investigation, no doubt, will affect its recommendations and conclusions about the specific criteria that perhaps should be applied now. So the questions that I'm raising are, very specifically, how to justify the differences, why and what rationale should apply to those differences between these aircraft and private or commercial aircraft. What's the rationale for treating them differently? The FAA should justify any gaps in this gray area of regulation that exist as a result of this exemption. This special set of conditions must be justified by a specific rationale that applies to these aircraft. And I want an explanation for the different inspection and maintenance criteria that are applied, and who makes the decision about whether an aircraft can fly if problems are found. There have been reports that there were problems with at least one of these engines before it flew on this B-17. Why there is no black box on these planes, and also why documents and records are kept on the plane itself, apparently, rather than in some central location. So there are all kinds of differences between the standards applied to these vintage 70-year-old planes, the differences between those kinds of criteria and any modern aircraft criteria have to be justified, especially because of the age and the difference in design and construction. And the purpose of our letter is to begin asking questions, literally to ask questions, not to draw conclusions, certainly not to ground these planes, and not to prejudge the results of the NTSB investigation.
So just to understand, there's no specific regulations, or is there even a definition for what makes a condition, or is it just that, as this letter indicates, they just ask not to have existing rules apply to them?
Well, one of the questions we're asking is, in fact, whether these same standards apply to all vintage planes, which are planes 50 years or older. Generally, the definition seems to be 50 years or older. But, you know, your question raises the history of, and I didn't want to go too deeply into the weeds, but you should know these standards have been revamped at least twice since 1996 when they were first applied. And apparently the definition of a vintage plane is that it's older than 50 years, but there are different regulations and different exemptions. And in fact, in 2011, a moratorium was applied for 4 years on any new exemption. The exemptions generally go to the organization. We want to know what other organizations have received these same kinds of exemptions. And the kinds of questions we're asking really go to basic safety. The point here is that these flights are potentially extremely risky. Like any flight in any aircraft may be, if there is inadequate inspection and maintenance. A 70-year-old plane needs special care, and passengers deserve to know all the risks and all of the latest inspections and maintenance that have been done, and they deserve safety, as do people on the ground.
Depending on your responses to this inquiry, would you then consider other actions? I mean, I mean, if you come back and they answer these inquiries and you determine that they're insufficient, what's the next steps after that? How do you do that?
Well, that's another good question. I'm a member of the Commerce, Science and Transportation Committee, which has jurisdiction over the FAA as well as the National Transportation Safety Board. The FAA is the primary Airline and Aviation Safety Agency. I would involve my colleagues on the committee in this review. If there is a need for hearing or more oversight, I will ask the chairman of the committee to begin it, and I will be talking to my colleagues about this entire issue when we go back. Because as you know, these organizations are across the country. There are air shows and living history flight experiences throughout the country, and potentially the effects are national. And in fact, the 21 crashes have occurred throughout the country, most recently in Texas.
Is it possible that you would seek some sort of legislation then? I mean, I don't, would it rise to the level of some sort of, a need for some sort of congressional action, or is it something that could be done through revamped regulations?
My expectation is that that the regulations will be revamped. I believe these regulations almost certainly will be revamped as a result of this crash, but also the history of other crashes of these vintage aircraft, because inspection, maintenance, repair, all are critical, especially when we're dealing with a 70-year-old plane. These vintage planes were designed to carry bombs, not tourists or sightseers. They were designed without the kind of containment for fuel that protects passengers when there are crashes and exist in commercial aircraft. They have a different structure, different construction, and they need to be reviewed with special care. And again, not to ground them, but simply to assure their safety.
You mentioned the black box and the records being on board. Are there other examples of conditions that you find alarming?
Well, you know, I've just mentioned the design and construction issues. These planes were not designed with the same structural protections that exist on commercial aircraft when there are crashes. For example, on those commercial aircraft, there are special containers for the fuel. They have specific names and so forth, nomenclature, but the basic idea is to protect against the fuel leaking and causing, tragically, the kind of fire that we saw on this plane. Likewise, the seat belts are different, and so are the seat arrangements. So there are a variety of differences here, and the question is, should some of that design or construction be required to be different in order to make them safe? Not unnecessarily adding to the cost, but there is clearly a need for another revamping. And I just want to emphasize, it's not as though this is a new idea for the FAA. They've revamped these regulations twice. They imposed a moratorium because of their own doubts and concerns. Now is the time to again revisit and review and potentially revamp these regulations. And I think it will be done through an administrative process, not necessarily legislative, but if necessary, we can go that route.
You've mentioned the moratorium a couple times. I mean, does that say something to you that maybe it's still inadequate and the FAA has perhaps recognized that more needs to be done?
What the moratorium says to me, one of its messages is that the FAA itself had concerns, so that it denied all petitions for exemptions for 4 years so that it could try to get it right. Well, in 2015, the moratorium ended. In 2018, this exemption was granted to Collings Foundation. There are, we don't know how many, exemptions to other similar foundations for an untold number of aircraft. Collings Foundation still has 9 more that are flying. And it's not just the B-17, it's the Labradors and the smaller planes that are out there in air shows and also carrying passengers. And the concern is not only for the passengers, it's also for people on the ground. innocent bystanders, like the person who was injured on Thursday.
Until these are reviewed and changes possibly made, what is your advice for consumers out there, for people who might be interested in taking a flight like this? What is your response to someone who may want to get on one of these planes tomorrow?
If I were going aboard one of these planes, I'd want to know when it was last inspected, what the training has been for the pilot, how recently there have been any kind of maintenance issues. I would want to know all the questions that should be asked by the FAA periodically in inspections, but may not have been about specific aircraft. That's not to prejudge what may be found about this B-17, but I think there has to be much fuller disclosure and specific information provided, and that's what I would be asking as someone about to board one of these planes, because people should know the standards, criteria, requirements for safety relating to these planes are not the ones on the normal commercial flight that you board, thinking the FAA has done its work. These criteria are different. And part of the reason they're different is because the planes are different, but also the operators lack the same kinds of resources. And it is a combination of factors, not blaming anyone, but just to require full disclosure.
Maybe because I'm not as familiar with how this would work normally, but say there was possible engine trouble on a commercial plane and we're about to take off and that same kind of situation was playing out. Would there be a difference in how that was handled if they were experiencing some kind of issue before takeoff?
Well, one of the questions that we're raising is who makes the decision about whether the maintenance issue has been resolved. If you've ever flown commercially and there is a maintenance issue, you're stuck on the ground for a while because there's a chain of decision making, the airline and possibly even the airport and the FAA, and here there may be no such kind of check and balance. And we want to know what the decision-making process is if there is a maintenance issue. Again, not prejudging that there's a problem with this B-17 in that regard, but simply that we want to know what are the general procedures.
Do you know people, like, if these people had to sign waivers or anything before they went on the plane?
My understanding is that liability waivers are signed.
Okay, just curious.
Do you feel the FAA should do something in the meantime? I know you said you don't want these flights to be grounded, but they should, because the average person, even if you show them the inspection records, they're not necessarily going to know what it means. Even if you flew on these planes back in World War II, you're probably not familiar with FAA regulations, so they could show you these books and you're not going to understand what the laws mean. Should the FAA do something while they're reviewing these to make sure people are safe?
Well, part of the reason we're writing this letter is because the NTSB investigation may take a year or more. Before we have any recommendations or conclusions from the NTSB, the FAA has a responsibility to act. If it reviews these regulations and finds that there should be more stringent safety requirements, we want the FAA to act very deliberately but very promptly to assure the safety of these airplanes. They are older. They require special care. They've been reconstructed or restored. And the FAA ought to drill down on the safety requirements to make sure that they're adequate. And it's, again, it's not just Collings Foundation. There are other similar operators around the country who have the same goals, give people the living history experience. It's a great goal, but we want to make sure that the aircraft are safe.
Sid, and I have a question. I would presume, you know, since the FAA is in charge of aviation, they're also in charge of commercial airports like Bradley. And I'm gathering from reading about this that these historical flights often don't take off from military bases, they're coming and going from commercial airports. Now, what about that? Is that a concern? I mean, should they, like, an air show usually happens at a military base versus this was, they came into Bradley and we're charging money to go in and out of Bradley.
Yeah.
Is that something someone's gonna look at?
Well, the FAA has a responsibility to review the question of venues. We didn't raise it in this letter. I'm not implying that having the plane at Bradley was a mistake, but it raised the concern about other structures, other bystanders, and planes that might be impacted if there were this kind of crash. Obviously, and fortunately, this plane averted any kind of larger disaster, probably due to the skills of the pilot, and that's extremely fortunate, despite the tragic loss of life that occurred.
Senator, have you gathered any kind of a general consensus in this kind of industry, the tourism education, on how common it is for them to charge
Thank you.
for the experience, and whether that changes in any regulations?
The common practice is to charge, as was done here. In this instance, my understanding is that it was done as a donation,
Like a tax-deductible donation?
because it's a nonprofit. I'm not sure whether that is the general practice. And I also am not sure whether there are any legal implications resulting from the fact that it's done as a donation. Likewise, I haven't reviewed the liability waiver. Generally, as a former Attorney General, I'm skeptical about fine print and liability waivers, so I want to see this one. But the point is that generally they do charge. They are, in that sense, passengers who pay for the ride, and I'm not sure what the implications are legally as to the operator's responsibility, but certainly the fact that they pay or not in no way diminishes the responsibility of the FAA.
These 23 fatalities and 21 accidents, that's all bombers from this era and not just the B-17? Because I think we heard from, maybe it was NTSB last week, that the B-17 specifically, they don't have a lot of records of crashes.
Correct. The B-17s, I think, were 3 of the crash. I'm not sure how many exactly, but it's not the majority, certainly not all of those crashes.
Slightly off topic, but still in connection with this plane crash, is the firefighting foam, the PFAS. Do you have any? There's rising concerns about the drinking water, especially in the Farmington River. What, in your mind, needs to be done to make sure that people are safe?
That is a very relevant question. In fact, what should be done is the FAA should tell airports that they need not use foam or other firefighting equipment with PFAS. Until recently, the FAA specifically required that PFAS content foam or firefighting substances be used and stored. It has said it's going to end that requirement, but it hasn't done so. And Bradley and other airports should be given the discretion, as well as the military, to use non-PFAS products. And second, the Department of Defense should take action to end any use of PFAS products, which the Secretary of Defense is doing, partly, I think, because I requested it as a member of the Armed Services Committee. We've also written to the FAA on this point, and the next element is that federal authorities, namely the EPA, ought to establish that this kind of substance, PFAS, is a hazardous one and should provide federal aid in cleanups. so that if there are expenses in connection with the Farmington River or any other area of Connecticut resulting from the previous leak or potentially this one, there should be federal assistance, as there is for other hazardous materials and sites.
Should Congress, I mean, if the FAA says you don't have to use this anymore, I'm sure a lot of airports will still continue using it, at least while they have the supply. Should Congress also take action here to go further, or do you think that that's?
I genuinely hope that the airports, and it's not just airports, it's all of the firefighting services. For example, in Connecticut, a lot of the local fire services have PFAS content products. They have them because they were bought in previous years before there was any knowledge about the harmful effects of PFAS. And obviously replacing them would be very expensive. Well, there should be some kind of aid to those local fire departments. And they are very supportive of this idea as long as the cost is covered. So PFAS is as you know, PFAS is, first of all, there are lots of different types of PFAS products and compounds. They're used in a wide variety of consumer products. Pizza boxes now have been cited frequently as having PFAS. So are many other common consumer packaging products. So it's a broader topic than just airports.
Another subject, if I could. The state senator has put out a press release today that either, depending on which way you read it, either he's going to pursue legislation on the state level to allow college athletes to accept endorsement pay, or he's going to gauge interest in introducing such legislation here. We obviously had Senator
You
Murphy
mean
speak out earlier this year.
along the lines of the California
Yes,
law?
along the lines of what California did. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts.
Well, you know, I'm actually considering a kind of athlete's bill of rights, because this area is only one of a number of areas where there is very drastic unfairness to college athletes. There are areas of discrimination, of potential sexual assault, of other kinds of problems that athletes deserve protection against. And I think that, you know, I support very strongly some kind of fairer treatment of athletes, financially and otherwise. And they deserve broader kinds of safeguards against potential exploitation and unfair treatment.
And do you care to offer your thoughts on the President's decision regarding Syria? And
I think this decision is a disaster. You know, once again, we are turning our back on allies. Here it's the Kurds, and favoring our adversaries, ISIS. The Kurds have been our most reliable partners in the fight against ISIS in that region, by far, bar none. And we are now, in effect, harming our allies by giving the Turks free rein in this region and spreading conflagration, strengthening ISIS, and actually aiding Russia and potentially even Iran. So this step is ill-considered and very tragically misguided for our allies and for our own national interests.
Back to the college sports, do you think it's going too far to pay the athletes, or what is your position on that?
I think that some kind of financial consideration should be examined and move forward. Some kind of fair financial compensation and consideration, whether it is the possibility of endorsements or some direct payment, it ought to be considered. And probably there needs to be a step-by-step process to implement it, but clearly athletes deserve fair treatment on campuses and on the playing fields at other levels as well. And as you may know, I've offered legislation on Olympic athletes to protect against the kinds of abuses that occurred with Larry Nassar. That legislation has been introduced, and I'm hoping that it will be marked up sometime this fall. But the protections against abuse, unfair treatment, and financial exploitation all need to be considered. And that's why a larger kind of Bill of Rights may be appropriate.
And would it be up to the individual schools to decide? In other words, Penn State might want to pay their players or come some kind of compensation, whereas UConn, which has been doing too well lately, might not.
I think there should be some discretion for schools, but also some standard policy. Just as there is right now on scholarships, for example. Schools can decide whether or not to award scholarships, but there are rules applied to recruiting and other steps that involve, in effect, a form of payment. Let's face it, scholarships are a form of compensation. And I think that the time is now to consider additional compensation that effectively recognize the increased financial needs of these athletes and opportunities.
So do you have a preference for if it's done compensation through the school or California, you can profit off your likeness, basically endorsements? Do you have a preference for one model or the other?
I think that both models should be considered, and I want to hear more about what the colleges think. What I don't want to hear is simply dismissing it without accepting the need for some kind of fairer treatment of athletes.
Do you think that's what the NCAA is doing right now? They're just trying to dismiss it and not be fair?
Some schools are very dismissive, and frankly, the NCAA has been pretty dismissive.
Yeah, in other words, they've been dragging their feet on this whole issue. Is that your view?
They've been dragging their feet and dragging their minds, really, in failing to consider more thoughtfully and positively what the opportunities are here for benefiting the athletes and fairly treating them. And there's no excuse for simply dismissing this idea out of hand. Okay. Thank you.